In 1959, a racist inmate openly provoked Bumpy Johnson inside Alcatraz, blocking his path, stealing his food, and daring him to react in front of guards. 7 days later, the man was carried out of the cafeteria screaming, missing an eye, and no alarm had been raised in time. If silence is weakness, why did the loudest bully fall the fastest when Bumpy finally stood up? Chapter 1. The Rock doesn't forgive 700 words. Alcatraz in 1959 wasn't a prison in the way people imagine prisons. It was a machine built to reduce men to routine and then punish them for having a pulse. The Rock didn't need to be loud to be lethal. Its power was in what it forced you to do every day without complaint. The island sat in the cold air of San Francisco Bay like a verdict that never expired. You could see the city from the yard on clear days, close enough to feel cruel, far enough to feel impossible. In here, hope wasn't banned by rules, it was erased by repetition. Meals moved like clockwork, head counts cut the day into hard squares, and silence was treated like good behavior. Guards didn't have to threaten you often because the building did it for them. The corridors carried a lesson every man learned quickly. The system always wins time, and time always wins you. Violence didn't announce itself with shouting the way it did in street stories. It hid in small humiliations, in accidents that weren't accidents, in a shoulder check that landed just right. Most trouble never became a report because the worst damage was the kind that left no clean evidence. That's what made Alcatraz effective. It trained everyone to speak in codes. A look could be a warning, a pause could be permission, and a smile could be a threat. Men didn't just watch the guards, they watched each other because the inmates controlled what the rules couldn't. Inside that ecosystem, official power was only half the story. The other half was reputation, and reputation traveled faster than any boat to the mainland. In Alcatraz, a man's name could protect him or paint a target so bright it didn't matter where he stood. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson arrived carrying a name that already had weight. By October 1959, he was 54 years old and deep into his 7th year of a 15-year sentence, and the prison had learned something about him that files couldn't capture. He wasn't the loudest man on the tier, and he didn't need to be. Bumpy moved with a kind of control that made people uncomfortable. He didn't rush to prove himself, didn't chase approval, didn't perform toughness for an audience. The men who survived longest in places like this recognized that posture immediately because it wasn't pride, it was calculation. Some inmates respected him for what he had been in Harlem, the rumors of money and discipline and a mind that didn't blink under pressure. Others respected him for what he was in Alcatraz, steady, watchful, and hard to read. In a prison that fed on reactions, the man who offered none became a problem no one could measure. And then there were the men who couldn't tolerate that kind of respect attached to a black man. Alcatraz had plenty of criminals, but it also had hierarchies older than the building itself. A few inmates and more than a few attitudes treated race like an invisible ranking system that never needed to be spoken out loud. That's where the real danger lived, not in open fights, but in the quiet decision to test the line. A bully didn't need to stab you to own you. He only needed to show everyone he could touch you, and nothing would happen. Once that lesson spread, the system of fear ran itself. Bumpy understood that better than most men on the island. He knew the first strike wasn't always a fist, it was an insult delivered in the right place at the right time, in front of the right witnesses. And he knew Alcatraz rewarded the person who could make you look guilty, even when you were the one being hunted. That week in October didn't begin with blood. It began with something smaller, sharper, and more public, a move designed to force Bumpy to choose between dignity and survival. The cafeteria, the showers, the yard. 3 stages where power could be displayed without a formal fight. People later argued over exactly who noticed first and how long the tension had been building before the rest of the island felt it. Former inmates described it as a change in the air, like the prison had leaned forward to listen. In a place where records often captured outcomes but not pressures, the details survived most clearly in the memories of men who had to live through them. By midweek, the story was moving faster than the guards could contain. Men were whispering at the railings, watching who sat where, who walked past whom, who looked away first. You didn't need an announcement to know something was forming, you only needed to notice how quickly people stopped laughing. Because Alcatraz didn't forgive mistakes, but it did reward patterns. A man who let himself be disrespected once could be disrespected again, and then again until he belonged to the humiliation. And a man who responded too early could disappear into solitary, while the bully walked free smiling like the system had chosen a side. Bumpy didn't respond the way the island expected. He didn't flare up, didn't bargain, didn't ask for protection. That wouldn't come. He did something more unnerving. He watched, he waited, and he made sure every witness would remember who started it. On the rock, patience wasn't peace. Patience was positioning. And by the time October 23rd arrived, the prison wasn't asking whether there would be consequences, only what form they would take, and whether anyone could stop them once the countdown reached 0. Chapter 2. The Man Who Thought He Was Untouchable. 600 words. Just high-tension investigative crime tone. 2-4 sentences per paragraph. Eric Polson did not arrive at Alcatraz by chance. Men like him were sent there when every other prison had already failed. The Rock was where the system placed its most dangerous problems and hoped the ocean would finish the work. At 38, Polson was built to intimidate before he spoke. Over 6 feet tall, nearly 275 pounds, his body was the product of years spent treating prison weight rooms like armories. Size was his first language, and he spoke it fluently. But Polson's real weapon wasn't muscle, it was certainty. He moved like a man who believed consequences applied to other people. His record followed a pattern officials rarely discussed openly. Multiple murders carried out without hesitation, all marked by efficiency rather than rage. What alarmed administrators most was not what he did, but how comfortably he explained it. There was no remorse in his words, no attempt to soften or deny. Polson justified his violence as if it were logic, not brutality. That mindset made him impossible to house in ordinary facilities. He didn't just commit violence, he stabilized it, normalized it, and let it seep into the air. Wherever he stayed, tension followed. Alcatraz accepted Polson because other prisons had run out of options. Transfers followed assaults. Assaults followed complaints, and complaints were buried under procedure. Officially, it was a security relocation. In reality, it was exile. The Rock specialized in men who believed themselves above limits. Polson arrived convinced he had finally found a place where his reputation would shield him. He believed the island existed to contain others, not him. Inside Alcatraz, he adapted with unsettling speed. He memorized guard rotations, blind spots, and how long attention lingered before drifting away. He learned which rules were enforced and which ones only existed on paper. Polson didn't rush into fights that created reports. He didn't swing first where witnesses were unavoidable. Instead, he perfected a quieter method. Pressure without proof. Dominance without paperwork. Food vanished from trays in full view of others. Paths narrowed in hallways until men learned to step aside without being asked. Showers became territorial long before fists ever flew. He bumped shoulders just hard enough to hurt, never hard enough to bleed. He whispered insults when footsteps echoed too far away to carry sound. Every move was calibrated to stay just below the line. In Alcatraz, that line mattered. Cross it and you vanished into solitary. Stay beneath it and the system pretended nothing was happening. Other inmates noticed quickly. Not just the men Polson targeted, but the ones watching from a distance. They saw what happened when Polson tested someone and nothing followed. Fear spread without instruction. Compliance became reflex. In a place like Alcatraz, reflex was survival. Some guards noticed Polson's behavior. Others noticed and chose not to intervene. Officially, he was labeled difficult, but manageable. Unofficially, his actions aligned with attitudes the system still tolerated. He didn't challenge authority, he reinforced a hierarchy that already existed. That made him useful. Usefulness bought silence. As long as Poulsen kept violence below the threshold that forced reports, he was ignored. Not protected, simply left alone. Poulsen mistook that silence for approval, and approval to a man like him meant immunity. By 1959, he had spent 2 years refining this method without serious consequence. No extended isolation, no added years, no real punishment. Each day confirmed the same belief. He was untouchable. Then Bumpy Johnson entered his orbit. Poulsen didn't see an aging inmate nearing the end of his prime. He saw a contradiction he could not accept. A black man receiving respect. A name spoken carefully. A presence that did not flinch. In Poulsen's world, respect was finite. Someone like Bumpy was not supposed to possess any of it. That imbalance demanded correction. So Poulsen decided to test him the same way he tested everyone else. Publicly. Slowly, where witnesses mattered. He expected fear reaction removal. What he didn't recognize was patience. He mistook restraint for weakness and silence for surrender. Each unanswered insult fed his confidence. Former inmates later described Poulsen that week as relaxed, almost amused. He laughed more, lingered, longer, pushed harder. Men who believe they are untouchable don't rush, they savor the moment. Poulsen never realized every step was being watched. Every humiliation was being logged not on paper, but in memory. And in Alcatraz, memory was the most dangerous record of all. The first move was small enough to look harmless. That was the point. In Alcatraz, the most effective attacks were the ones that could be laughed off by people who weren't paying attention. It happened in the cafeteria where meals were timed and silence was enforced. Bumpy Johnson sat with 3 other inmates, tray-centered posture, relaxed eyes forward. Nothing about the scene suggested conflict. Poulsen walked past without stopping. As he did, his hand dropped casually and lifted the apple pie from Bumpy's tray, the dessert sliding away as if it had never belonged there. He didn't break stride. The room noticed. Forks paused, mid-air conversations died, and several men looked toward Bumpy to see what would happen next. In Alcatraz, reactions mattered more than insults. Bumpy glanced at the empty space on his tray. He looked up once, then returned to eating as if nothing had happened. No words, no movement, no visible change in his expression. Some inmates at the table stiffened. A few shifted in their seats, already preparing for consequences that never came. Poulsen sat down across the room and ate the pie, slowly smiling. By itself, the gesture meant nothing on paper. No punch thrown, no threat spoken, no rule violated. But everyone in that cafeteria understood the message clearly. It wasn't about food. It was about ownership. 2 days later, Poulsen raised the pressure. The setting changed, but the strategy stayed the same. The prison showers were loud enough to mask sound and crowded enough to manufacture accidents. Bumpy was rinsing when Poulsen stepped into the space directly beside him, ignoring open stalls. The shove came without warning, sharp enough to force Bumpy into the wall. Water splashed, footing slipped, and balance had to be recovered quickly. Poulsen said something then loud enough for nearby inmates to hear. Not a threat. Not a challenge. A statement of entitlement. Bumpy stood still for a moment, water running down his back. He didn't square up. He didn't respond. He simply stepped away and finished washing at another stall. To some watching, it looked like retreat. To others, it felt wrong in a way they couldn't explain. Poulsen watched closely, measuring the result. The third test came in the yard. Recreation time was limited, and the walking path around the perimeter was narrow enough to force interaction. Men moved in loops, avoiding eye contact, conserving energy. Bumpy was walking with two other inmates when Polson stepped directly into his path. He didn't shove this time. He didn't touch him at all. He stood there and waited. The moment stretched longer than it should have. Bumpy looked at Polson, then stepped off the path and walked around him, without a word. The path cleared. Polson laughed. The sound carried. Several heads turned. Polson didn't follow, didn't escalate, didn't need to. The message had already landed. By midweek, the story had spread through the cell blocks. 3 incidents, all public, all unanswered. To inmates who didn't understand prison math, it looked like weakness. But the older men didn't laugh. They watched. In places like Alcatraz, the first response is rarely the real one. The first response is positioning. It's the act of letting the other man expose himself completely. Bumpy Johnson did not respond because responding too early would have solved Polson's problem. A fight would have ended with solitary confinement and official punishment. The system would have closed the file. Silence kept it open. Witnesses later disagreed on what Bumpy was thinking during those days. Some said he looked calm. Others said he looked distant. A few remembered a slight smile that came and went too quickly to interpret. What they agreed on was this: Polson grew more confident with each encounter. His movements became looser, his timing bolder, his patience thinner. Men who feel protected don't rush. They expand. By Thursday, even the guards sensed a shift. The yard grew quieter. Meals ended faster. People stopped sitting in certain seats. Nobody said Bumpy's name out loud. They didn't have to. In Alcatraz, unanswered humiliation was never the end of a story. It was the opening chapter of something worse. And by the time Polson finished laughing in the yard, the test was already over. He just didn't know which answer he had given. In prison, the first man to react is almost always the one who loses. Not because he is weaker, but because he gives the system what it needs to end the story early. A reaction creates a record, and a record erases context. Alcatraz was built to reward impatience. A shove returned with a punch became a fight became paperwork, and paperwork reduced everything to a single line in a logbook. Once that line existed, the truth stopped mattering. Bumpy Johnson understood this equation better than most men on the rock. He knew that reacting too soon didn't punish the bully, it protected him. The system didn't care who started it, only who made it visible. In places like Alcatraz, violence without witnesses was chaos. Violence with witnesses could be power, but only if the timing was exact. Strike too early, and the system swallowed you whole. That was the psychology Eric Polson failed to grasp. He believed power came from provoking a response, not from controlling the conditions around it. Every insult he delivered was bait meant to force a mistake, and Bumpy refused to take it. Each time Polson tested him, Bumpy absorbed the insult and returned to routine. No raised voice, no change in posture, no visible anger. Among inmates who had survived long sentences, silence was never mistaken for fear. It was read as preparation. Older men noticed the pattern immediately, and they stopped laughing. Bumpy was not avoiding conflict. He was shaping it. Each unanswered insult stretched Polson's confidence, further convincing him the system had already chosen sides. This was the rope, and Polson was helping tie it himself. With every public humiliation, he made the next one easier. In prison culture, there is an unwritten rule older than any handbook. If you strike first, you own the consequences. If you respond last, you control the narrative. Bumpy needed Polson to cross a line no one could ignore. Not a rumor, not a private shove. Something public, repeated, and witnessed. The longer Polson operated without resistance, the more reckless he became. His movements loosened, his timing grew bolder, and his insults turned into performances. Men who believe they are untouchable always start playing to an audience. That shift mattered. A private altercation could be buried, but a public provocation created pressure the administration couldn't erase. The more witnesses there were, the fewer exits the system had. Bumpy let that pressure build deliberately. He sat at the same table, walked the same routes, and followed the same routines. Consistency made every incident harder to deny. To outsiders, it looked passive. Inside Alcatraz, it looked surgical. Men whispered that Bumpy was letting it happen, and they were right for a reason. Reacting early wasn't just dangerous, it was strategic suicide. An early fight would have turned Bumpy into the problem, and Polson into background noise. The system would have closed the file and moved on. But patience kept the file open. It forced the system to keep watching even when it didn't want to. Every day, Polson escalated without consequence, made the eventual response unavoidable. By midweek, the prison felt different. The yard grew quieter, meals ended faster, and laughter disappeared from certain tables. In a prison, that kind of silence isn't calm, it's anticipation. Polson mistook that silence for victory. He mistook restraint for surrender, and patience for weakness. That mistake is common among men who have never had to wait for consequences. By Thursday night, Polson believed he had won. He had humiliated Bumpy publicly and suffered nothing in return. What he didn't understand was that he had already lost control of the outcome. He had created witnesses, established a pattern, and crossed from provocation into inevitability. The countdown had started, even if no one announced it. In Alcatraz, the most dangerous moments never arrived with noise, they arrived when silence stopped feeling accidental. Polson crossed the line on a Thursday afternoon, not with a knife or a threat, but with a choice. He stopped targeting the man who could answer him, and turned toward the one who couldn't. In prison, that decision is irreversible. Robert Jackson was 23, and slight the kind of inmate who survived by keeping his head down. He had no reputation, no alliances, and no history of violence that anyone respected. To Polson, that made him ideal. Jackson was sitting alone during recreation, reading a book he had checked out days earlier. He wasn't watching. Anyone wasn't listening, wasn't part of the tension that had settled over the yard. He was trying to disappear. Polson approached without hurry. He didn't shout, didn't posture, didn't draw attention from guards. He simply took the book from Jackson's hands and looked at it as if it were evidence of a mistake. Witnesses later recalled Polson making a remark that drew quiet laughter from nearby benches. The words differed slightly, depending on who told the story, but the meaning didn't change. Jackson was being reminded where Polson believed he belonged. Jackson stood up and asked for the book back. Not loudly, not angrily, just enough to register resistance. That was when Polson struck him. The blow wasn't meant to incapacitate. It was meant to humiliate. Polson hit Jackson across the face with the book hard enough to knock him off balance and send him to the ground. The yard froze. A few inmates stood, then hesitated. Guards moved closer but didn't rush in. Polson stepped over Jackson and dropped the book into a shallow puddle near a drain. He said something else, then louder this time, words designed to travel. The message was clear. This was what happened when someone like Jackson forgot his place. Jackson didn't fight back. He covered his face and stayed down, stunned more by the suddenness than the pain. Blood showed briefly, then disappeared as he wiped it away with his sleeve. Guards intervened late and lightly. Polson was separated, warned, and told to move along. Jackson was sent to the infirmary, then returned to his cell with a note that would never carry much weight. Some accounts say Jackson's injuries were minor. Others remember swelling and a split lip that took days to fade. What everyone agreed on was the response had ended too quickly. For Polson, the lesson was immediate. He had escalated publicly, and nothing meaningful had happened. The system had blinked. That evening, the story moved through the cell blocks faster than the guards could slow it. Men repeated the details in whispers, correcting each other, sharpening the edges. By lights out, everyone knew who Polson had chosen and who had been watching. Bumpy Johnson heard the story without comment. He didn't ask questions, didn't react, didn't summon anyone. He listened once and nodded. Those close enough to notice saw the change. Not anger, not panic, but finality. The calculation was over. Poulsen hadn't just insulted Bumpy anymore. He had attacked someone Bumpy couldn't ignore. In prison culture, that mattered more than pride. There is an unspoken rule that governs places like Alcatraz. You can endure humiliation aimed at you, but when it spills onto the weak, the obligation shifts. Silence stops being strategy and becomes permission. Bumpy knew the system would not protect Jackson. It had already demonstrated that. He also knew that responding later would mean responding too late. That night, witnesses recalled Bumpy sitting longer than usual, hands folded, eyes unfocused. When he finally spoke, it wasn't loud, and it wasn't dramatic. It was specific. He said tomorrow would be different. No plan was announced. No instructions were given. But the tone traveled faster than words. Poulsen, meanwhile, felt untouchable. He had crossed a visible line and walked away without consequence. That kind of success changes a man's posture. He lingered longer the next morning. He spoke louder. He chose seats he hadn't chosen before. By then, the prison understood something Poulsen didn't. The test had ended, and the result wasn't in his favor. In Alcatraz, the most dangerous mistake isn't violence. It's choosing the wrong brother to make an example of. The conversation happened after lights out, when Alcatraz sounded like it was holding its breath. The tears were quiet, not calm, and men spoke in low voices because echoes carried consequences. Nothing about that night suggested urgency. Bumpy Johnson sat on the edge of his bunk, posture unchanged from earlier days. He didn't pace, didn't rehearse, didn't ask questions that needed answers. He listened once, then let the silence do the work. A few inmates gathered close enough to hear him without asking to be heard. They weren't looking for instructions. They were looking for confirmation. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten anyone. He said one word that carried more weight than a speech. Tomorrow. It wasn't delivered like a warning. There was no emphasis, no flourish, no attempt to intimidate. The word landed flat and final, like a date written at the top of a report. In prison, threats are loud. Schedules are quiet. The difference matters. Those who heard him understood immediately. Tomorrow didn't mean retaliation at some undefined point. It meant timing had been selected and conditions were already in place. No one asked where. No one asked how. In Alcatraz, those questions came only from men who didn't understand the answer. The decision wasn't emotional. It was procedural. Poulsen had crossed a line the system would not step in to correct, and that left only one remaining mechanism. Bumpy chose the most public place possible, not because he wanted attention, but because attention was protection. In a prison built on selective blindness, visibility was leverage. Private violence could be denied. Public violence demanded explanation. The cafeteria was the only room where everyone gathered under supervision and routine. Guards watched from fixed positions, lines of sight mapped movement, predictable. It was where the system felt safest. That made it the most dangerous place to challenge it. Choosing the cafeteria wasn't bravado. It was containment. Any response there would be seen, timed, and recorded by dozens of eyes. That mattered. Bumpy understood that the system feared ambiguity more than violence. If something happened where no one could pretend it didn't, the story could not be buried. Tomorrow also meant witnesses. Not just inmates, but guards who would later be asked what they saw and when they saw it. It meant removing exits before anyone realized they were needed. Those who heard Bumpy speak that night described his tone the same way: calm, certain, uninterested in reaction. Some remembered him folding his hands afterward. Others remembered him lying back without another word. The details varied, but the meaning did not. The decision was locked. Poulsen slept well that night, according to men who shared his tear. He joked, laughed, and spoke as if the week had ended in his favor. Men who believe they are untouchable rarely sense the moment the ground shifts. He had misread the silence. He thought it meant fear. He didn't understand it meant scheduling. By morning, the atmosphere in Alcatraz had changed again. Movements were sharper, conversations, shorter eyes, more alert. Men chose seats carefully without explaining why. No signal was given. None was needed. Bumpy followed routine. He washed, dressed, and lined up for breakfast like every other inmate. Nothing about his behavior suggested urgency. That was intentional. Urgency draws attention before timing allows. Bumpy had waited too long to rush now. Former inmates later disagreed on whether Polson noticed anything was different. Some said he looked restless. Others said he looked confident. A few said he smiled more than usual. What they agreed on was this: he did not expect consequences that day. Tomorrow had not been a promise of violence. It had been a notice of procedure, a marker placed on the calendar when patience expired. In places like Alcatraz, men don't announce decisions unless they intend to carry them out, and they don't choose public rooms unless they want the system watching when it happens. By the time the lunch bell rang, the schedule was set. Not by guards, not by reports. By a man who understood that power in prison wasn't about speed or strength. It was about choosing the moment no one else could stop. And when Bumpy Johnson stepped into the cafeteria that afternoon, tomorrow had already arrived. At 12:15 p.m., the cafeteria moved the way it always did. Trays slid, benches scraped, guards watched from fixed angles, and 200 men followed a routine designed to drain emotion out of hunger. Bumpy Johnson took his seat without hurry. He placed his tray down, aligned it square to the table, and began eating as if nothing in the room concerned him. Eric Polson arrived minutes later. Instead of heading to his assigned table, he crossed the aisle and sat directly across from Bumpy, close enough for others to hear him without raising his voice. The last provocation was not elaborate. It didn't need to be. Polson leaned forward and said enough to draw eyes, choosing words meant to humiliate and to travel. Nearby tables went quiet. Forks paused. Men leaned back just slightly, not to see better but to make space. Bumpy didn't answer. He finished the bite he was chewing and set his fork down carefully, the way men do when they intend to stand. He rose without speed. His movement was smooth, controlled, and unremarkable until it wasn't. What happened next unfolded too fast for most witnesses to describe cleanly. Later accounts would differ on angles and exact motions, but the timing remained consistent. Less than 3 seconds. Bumpy closed the distance in a straight line. There was no shout, no warning, no wasted motion designed to impress anyone watching. The first strike landed and ended Polson's confidence instantly. It was precise, deliberate, and final in its intent. The second followed immediately. Not harder, not faster, just complete. Polson screamed as he fell backward, hands moving too late to protect what had already been lost. Blood spread across the floor in a way that stopped the room completely. Guards reacted then. Whistles cut through the noise, orders followed, and weapons came up, but the action was already over. Bumpy stepped back and dropped what he was holding. He raised his hands before anyone reached him and waited to be taken down. There was no pursuit, no additional strike, no attempt to finish what had been started. The room didn't explode into chaos the way movies suggest. Men froze, backed away, or sat perfectly still, unsure of where safety now existed. Polson was on the floor, screaming and trying to understand what had happened to his face. Guards moved to him while others secured Bumpy, separating cause from effect with practiced efficiency. Medical staff arrived quickly. Polson was carried out on a stretcher, leaving a trail no one tried to clean until long after the room was cleared. The cafeteria emptied in silence. No one spoke. No one needed to. What remained was the aftermath. Not just the physical damage, but the recalibration of power that happens when an assumption collapses publicly. Later, medical reports would outline the injuries in clinical language. Cuts, stitches, permanent damage that could not be undone. There were no photographs released, no official images circulated. The details lived in charts and in the memories of men who had been close enough to hear the scream begin. Bumpy was placed in restraints and escorted out without resistance. He did not look back. Witnesses would later recall one sentence spoken before he was taken away. Accounts varied slightly, but the message did not. It was a warning, without emotion. A boundary stated clearly for anyone still confused. After that, nothing happened. No riot followed. No retaliation came. That absence mattered. In a prison like Alcatraz, violence usually echoes. This one ended the moment it began. The system responded the way it always did. An investigation was opened, statements were taken, timelines were assembled. What the paperwork could not capture was the shift. The silence that followed Polson's removal wasn't fear, it was understanding. Men returned to their routines changed. Seats went unclaimed, paths widened, voices lowered themselves automatically. The test was over. The result was permanent. 3 seconds had been enough. Not to kill, not to chase, not to dominate beyond necessity. Just enough to end the problem. In Alcatraz, that was the difference between violence and control. The system moved quickly, but it did not move loudly. Within minutes of the incident, Alcatraz shifted into its most familiar posture: containment, without commentary. Doors closed, names were logged, and silence returned to the corridors. An internal investigation was opened the same afternoon. Guards were interviewed, statements were collected, and timelines were assembled with mechanical precision. The goal was not to tell a story, but to reduce one. On paper, the facts were uncomplicated. An inmate possessed a weapon. Another inmate was seriously injured. By regulation alone, that sequence usually ended with additional years added to a sentence. That didn't happen. Investigators encountered a problem they could not easily write around. Too many witnesses told the same story. Not word for word, but close enough to form a pattern. They described days of provocation, public insults, physical contact that stopped just short of triggering mandatory discipline. A final confrontation that occurred in full view of guards and inmates alike. The reports noted that Polson had not been seated at his assigned table. They noted that he initiated contact and escalated verbally. They noted that Bumpy Johnson had not pursued, had not continued once Polson was down, and had surrendered immediately. Those details mattered. In prison investigations, intent is difficult to prove. Pattern is not. And Polson's pattern had been documented informally long before the cafeteria incident forced it into the open. Officials faced an uncomfortable choice: punish Bumpy severely and implicitly admit they had failed to protect inmates from a known aggressor, or limit the punishment and quietly remove the variable that had exposed the weakness. They chose the second option. Bumpy Johnson was placed in solitary confinement for possession of a weapon and assault. 30 days. No additional years. No reclassification that would follow him beyond the island. The decision surprised some guards. It did not surprise the inmates. Inside Alcatraz, restraint by the administration was never read as mercy. It was read as acknowledgement. Polson's situation unfolded differently. His injuries required extended hospitalization, and his return to general population became an administrative question no one wanted to answer publicly. Within weeks, Polson was transferred out of Alcatraz. Officially, the move was attributed to medical needs and security considerations. Unofficially, it was a removal. The Rock had decided it no longer wanted him. There was no trial. No formal ruling issued to the public. No admission of fault. The system did not explain itself. It rarely did. Instead, the conclusion was implied through action. The aggressor was gone. The responder remained. Order returned without further incident. That outcome carried weight. Guards adjusted their routines subtly. Certain behaviors were addressed earlier than before. Certain lines were no longer tested as openly. The prison did not reform. It recalibrated. Former officials later described the decision as pragmatic. The incident had attracted attention inside the institution, and attention was dangerous. Allowing the situation to escalate further would have forced scrutiny no one wanted, so the file was closed carefully. Bumpy Johnson served his time in solitary without protest. He did not appeal. He did not speak publicly about the incident. When he returned to general population, he resumed his routine exactly where he had left it. No one challenged him again. The absence of retaliation mattered as much as the punishment itself. No friends of Polson tested boundaries. No copycat confrontations followed. The message had landed cleanly. In the weeks after Polson's transfer, Alcatraz grew quieter. Not calmer, just more precise. Men measured their actions differently. The system had stepped back, but not out of fear. Out of calculation. It had identified the cost of intervening too hard and the cost of intervening too little. This time it chose silence. No verdict was issued. No guilt was assigned in writing. But everyone involved understood the conclusion. Polson had been the problem. Bumpy had been the response. In institutions like Alcatraz, justice rarely arrives with language. It arrives with outcomes. And the outcome was unmistakable. After Polson was gone, nothing dramatic followed. There were no speeches, no announcements, no visible change in policy. What changed instead was behavior. The insult stopped first. Not gradually, not selectively, but completely. Words that had once been whispered with confidence no longer surfaced at all. Men who had built their presence on intimidation recalculated quickly. They lowered their voices, chose different seats, and learned new routes through shared spaces. Silence replaced bravado. The accidents ended next. No more shoulder checks in corridors. No more territorial shoves in the showers. No more blocked paths designed to force submission. It wasn't because rules had changed. It was because risk had. In Alcatraz, patterns mattered more than punishments. When a behavior ended without explanation, everyone understood why. Bumpy Johnson did not issue warnings after his return from solitary. He didn't patrol posture or remind anyone of what had happened. He resumed routine as if nothing required reinforcement. That restraint mattered. Violence repeated becomes noise. Violence used once, then never needed again, becomes law. Reputation filled the gap where force once lived. It traveled ahead of Bumpy into rooms he hadn't entered yet. It adjusted conversations before he arrived. Men who had never spoken to him referenced his name carefully. Others avoided using it at all. In prison culture, that avoidance is respect. Even guards noticed the shift. They didn't comment on it officially, but routines adjusted subtly. Interventions happened earlier. Lines were enforced sooner. The system didn't reform itself. It adapted. What didn't happen after Polson's removal was just as important as what did. There were no retaliations, no testing from associates, no escalation designed to reclaim lost ground. That absence told its own story. Former inmates later described the period that followed as stable, which in Alcatraz meant something rare. Tension didn't vanish, but it stopped spiking unpredictably. Bumpy became a fixed point in that stability, not a leader issuing commands, but a presence that discouraged mistakes before they happened. He didn't need to threaten anyone again. He didn't need to prove anything further. The proof already existed. The strongest deterrent in prison is not memory of pain. It is memory of consequence applied once and never challenged. Bumpy understood that instinctively. He had not won by being feared every day. He had won by making fear unnecessary. Years later, when former inmates spoke about that period, their accounts varied in detail but aligned in meaning. They described a prison that learned its limits without being told. They described a moment when power stopped announcing itself and started being assumed. No official memo documented the change. No report credited a single incident with altering behavior. The system prefers plausible deniability. But memory does not require authorization. Bumpy Johnson served the rest of his sentence without further incident. No challenges, no tests, no repeat of violence. That quiet ending was the point. When he eventually left Alcatraz, the reputation remained behind. Men who had never seen Polson, never heard the scream, still understood the boundary. That is how real power works inside closed systems. It doesn't demand repetition. It doesn't seek reinforcement. It leaves a shape behind. In Alcatraz, silence returned to its original role, not as suppression but as acknowledgement. The kind that follows when everyone understands what will happen if certain lines are crossed again. The legacy was not the violence, it was the absence of it. And in a prison built to grind men down through constant pressure, that absence meant something. Deeper had shifted. The system didn't forgive. It didn't forget. It stepped back and stayed there. There was no death that day, no riot, no racial war inside Alcatraz. One man lost an eye and an entire system learned its limit. Bumpy Johnson didn't win with strength, he won with timing. Thank you for staying to the end of this file. Like, share, and subscribe for more hidden cases and suppressed truths. When records fall silent, did justice fail or did power choose a different ending?